My name is Emily Carter. I am 36 years old, and last Christmas Eve, my parents locked me outside their house while my family laughed inside with lights I had paid for. For years I covered every mortgage, every utility, every card they swiped without thinking, and they believed they could erase me with a turn of a lock. What they forgot was that all of it, every account and every draft, was under my name. That night I stopped being their silence and became their reckoning. Snow clung to my coat, and the porch boards groaned under a thin crust of ice as the door clicked shut and the lock slid into place. The neighborhood was strung with bright lights and inflatable reindeer that bobbed in the wind, but the sound that filled my chest was the muffled chorus of carols from inside my parents' house. I had pictured warmth and a plate ready at the table. What I got was a cool pane of wood against my gloved palm, and the steady weight of a decision already made. Robert stood in the entry when he opened the door. A crack posture, straight voice level the way teachers deliver rules they do not intend to revisit. He said there was no place for me tonight. Linda hovered behind his shoulder with that careful smile she uses at church fundraisers, kind at first glance and empty if you have known it long enough. She said it would be better if I left. The latch turned, and I was outside again, breath-fogging fingers tightening around a bag of wrapped gifts I had carried in from the car. I knocked once and waited. The chandelier over the foyer threw warm light across the glass, and I watched it ripple over my reflection. I pressed my palm to the wood and said their names, not loud, not pleading, just to be sure they heard me. No footsteps returned. I let my hand fall. Begging would change nothing, and I was tired of making it easy for people to feel right about shutting me out. Through the wide front window, the living room looked like the kind of catalog that used to arrive in our mailbox every December. Gold ribbon trailed from the banister. The tree was full and symmetrical, a metal star balanced on top like a crown. My father lifted a glass. My mother adjusted the garland that ran along the mantel. My brother Daniel laughed in that way he does when a story needs to be bigger than the truth. My aunts leaned in, cousins perched on the arms of sofas, everyone close enough to share the same warmth. Then Chloe walked into view. Red silk caught the light, and her hair moved like a commercial, every strand obedient. She did not look surprised to find me on the other side of the glass. She looked pleased that I could see exactly what I had been denied. She drifted to the window and raised her flute a tiny toast toward the cold. Her mouth shaped words for the people around her, and several heads turned to follow her hand as she tipped it in my direction. A cousin covered a laugh behind his wrist. Someone else leaned to whisper, and then the window became a mirror again, as Chloe reached up and pulled the curtain back just enough to erase me from their frame. The wind pushed along the eaves, and I tucked my chin into the collar of my coat. The bag of gifts bumped my knee as I stepped off the porch. Paper crinkled ribbon rasped against ribbon. I had chosen each thing with the quiet hope that a thoughtful object could take the place of understanding a ridiculous habit I had never quite broken. The snow in the driveway came up over my ankles and soaked the hem of my jeans before I reached the car parked under the streetlight. I slid into the driver's seat and pulled the door shut. The interior smelled like stale coffee, and the pine air freshener clipped to the vent. I started the engine, and the heater coughed cold air at my knees. I sat with my hands on the steering wheel and felt the tremor in my fingers settle into a different kind of shake. It was not the kind that comes from cold. It was the kind that comes when a line you hoped was imaginary reveals itself in permanent ink. For a while, I just watched the house. The front door opened, and a late guest hurried inside with a casserole dish balanced in both hands, cheeks pink from the air. The door closed quickly, as if it had been told to. A shadow crossed the upstairs landing. Laughter rose, then a round of applause, the sound carrying even through snow. I remembered other nights just like this one when my card covered an overdue bill and my name signed for a delivery, and nobody asked who made it possible for the lights to glow and the furnace to hum. I remembered the text that arrived last month from Daniel asking for a little help until his next deal closed, and the day before Thanksgiving when Linda asked if I could move a payment so her account would not bounce. None of that had been considered a ticket at the door tonight. The heater warmed enough that the windows began to fog along the edges. I wiped a circle with my sleeve and caught a brief glimpse of my own face, reflected with the tree behind it. 36, and still learning that being useful is not the same as being loved. It landed with a dull mercy. There is clarity even in cruelty, when it stops pretending to be anything else. A couple passed on the sidewalk walking a dog in a sweater with little antlers. The dog lunged toward the snowbank, and the woman laughed a bright sound that did not sting. I breathed with it and let my shoulders drop. I took my phone from my coat pocket and set it on my thigh without unlocking it. The screen lit my hands a soft blue. The case was scuffed along the edge where it had knocked against my desk at the bank. Rocky Mountain Trust had been a second home for a decade. Numbers made sense the way families did not. Numbers rewarded work. Numbers kept records. I thought about the automatic drafts I had set up the first year Robert retired, when he insisted he would handle everything, and then forgot 2 payments in a row. I thought about the day Linda called me from the grocery store because her card would not run, and she was embarrassed at the register. I thought about the mortgage account I had refinanced under my credit to lower their rate, about the utilities I had consolidated so nothing would fall through the cracks, about the credit lines I had nudged upward so Daniel could breathe through another month. Practical choices. Quiet ones. The kind that build a scaffolding around a life until the people inside mistake it for the house itself. A strand of colored bulbs along the porch flickered and went dark for a second, then blinked back on. The small failure and recovery felt like a private joke shared with the night. I leaned back against the headrest and closed my eyes long enough to hear my own breathing over the music that still pressed against the glass. Hurt moved through me like water finds the path of least resistance, then it hit bedrock and stopped. I opened my eyes. The curtain in the front room shifted again. Chloe had returned to the window with 2 women from the neighborhood and angled them toward the view, like a docent pointing at an exhibit. Her hand traced a little circle in the air where I had been standing on the porch, and one of the women lifted her brows and nodded. Chloe laughed, head tipping back, the crystal in her ears catching the light. She did not know she had given me exactly what I needed. Not rage, not a scene. A clean end to doubt. I let the car idle and watched the clock on the dashboard slide forward by a minute. The heater was finally doing its job. My gloves were drying on the vent. My heartbeat had slowed from a hammer to a steady tap. I picked up my phone again and felt the familiar shape of it in my palm. I did not unlock it. Not yet. I wanted the house to settle in my mind the way a ledger settles after months of entries. I wanted to be sure that I would remember this moment as the turning point in the story. Snow thickened, softening the edges of the lawn ornaments and swallowing the footpaths to the curb. The light in the kitchen went on, and I could imagine the line of mugs on the counter, the punch bowl on the table, Linda's hands arranging napkins into crisp triangles. I imagined Robert telling someone that order had finally been restored. I pictured Chloe practicing that little wave that looks gracious in photographs. I knew what it cost to power a night like that. I also knew exactly whose name sat on the accounts that kept it lit and warm. I tucked the phone back into my pocket and rested both hands on the wheel. The next move would not be loud. It would not be dramatic. It would be accurate. I watched the house one more time and felt something align inside me, as if a long line of numbers had clicked into place and produced the answer that had been there all along. They had shut me out to make a point. They forgot the simplest one. I pulled in a slow breath and let it out, then looked down at the phone again, the blue light glancing off my wrist. The apps I use every day were sitting behind that lock screen, quiet and patient, waiting for instructions. I was done waiting. I unlocked the phone and let the home screen settle, then set it face down on my thigh and closed my eyes. Before I did anything, I wanted to be clear about how I got here. Clarity keeps you from mistaking reaction for choice. The snow ticking against the windshield kept time while I let the past line up in the order it always should have been told. When we were kids, Robert liked to brag about Chloe. He would say she was born for a stage, even if the stage was only a school hallway. He kept every ribbon she ever won, and no one was allowed to move the box where he stored them. Daniel was the lovable mess. If he forgot homework or dented the car, there was always a story and a laugh and a second chance. I was the child who made lists. Linda used to call me practical like it was a flaw she did not want to say out loud. I learned early that being reliable was not a personality anyone applauds at dinner. By high school, I had already figured out that applause was not coming, so I turned toward what I could control. Grades, a part-time job at the library, volunteer hours that turned into references. I earned a scholarship and a work-study package that covered most of my tuition at a state university. I took extra shifts in the campus finance office. Numbers were simple promises. If you did the work and kept the records clean, numbers turned into options. Freshman year, Daniel called to say his card was maxed, and he just needed a little help. It was a small balance, and I had a little saved from summer temp work, so I paid it and told myself it was a one-time thing. Sophomore year, Linda missed a mortgage payment. She said the bank had made an error. I knew it was a late fee. I moved money around from my student account and fixed it. Junior year, Robert forgot the gas bill in January, and the notice came in bright red. I remember sitting in a dorm lounge with a calculator and my coat still on, choosing between books for spring semester and the money to stop a shutoff. I put the books on a credit card in my name and paid the gas bill online. Nobody asked how I did it. Nobody said thank you either. The story in our house was that things had a way of working out. I was the way. After graduation, I took a full-time analyst job at Rocky Mountain Trust. I managed to pay down the student card, and then my loans slowly month by month until my credit pulled itself into the green. When Robert retired, he promised he would handle the household accounts with the same attention he gave to grading papers. 2 months later, I found a stack of late notices tucked under a newspaper on the hall table. I called the bank from their kitchen and spoke to a woman who recognized my voice from work. She helped me set up automatic drafts from an account I opened and funded myself. Linda told the neighbors the following week that Robert had everything under control. I did not correct her. Quiet fixes were the language we spoke. It went on like that for years. Daniel tried sales and then tried consulting and then tried real estate. Each try came with a pause where a bill needed a bridge. Chloe worked in public relations and knew how to frame every hiccup as a strategy. She said she was building her brand, which seemed to mean she posted dinners with the right people and waited for the invitations that followed. When an invitation did not come, she would call Linda, and Linda would call me, and the next day something would be paid, and nobody would have to be uncomfortable. There were bright spots that should have been my own. In 2018, I was promoted to senior specialist and moved into an office with a door that closed. I took a picture of the nameplate and sent it to the family group thread. Robert responded with a thumbs up. Linda reminded me that Sunday was the church bake sale, and could I bring the cash box early? I brought it, counted it, and stayed late to reconcile the totals after everyone else went home with leftover cupcakes. Then there was my college graduation. I can still see the line of students in their caps, the way the air smelled like wet grass and new beginnings. When it was over, I stood on the curb with my program folded into squares. The parents around me held flowers, clapped, kissed cheeks. I checked my phone again. A text finally arrived that evening. We thought it was tomorrow. I told myself it was a simple mistake. You can forgive a lot if you call it simple. The birthday in 2021 carved the shape of the truth in a way nothing else had. I had transferred a down payment to a dealership that afternoon. It was a deal I had negotiated to get Chloe a reliable car after she said hers was unsafe on the highway. The sales manager knew me from a corporate training our bank had run for small business owners. He shaved a little off the rate because I asked the questions that made him smile. That night, the family gathered in the driveway for the big reveal. Robert held the keys. Linda insisted on a bow the size of a beach umbrella. Daniel filmed on his phone like a director. They called it a family gift. They handed Chloe the keys and the speech that went with them. She cried a pretty cry. I stood off to the side with the paperwork tucked into my purse, the title temporarily in my name to secure the loan. No one asked who signed. No one said a word about the transfer I scheduled to cover the insurance premium. Later, Chloe posted a photo with a caption about blessings and legacy. She tagged everyone but me. When I saw it, the part of me that still wanted to be surprised finally went quiet. There were smaller cuts that bled slower. Thanksgiving 2019. The table full. Linda told a story about Chloe landing a client after calming a room with her charm. She looked at me and said that not everyone is built to make people feel welcome. I remember the exact way she set down her fork after. She meant it as a compliment to Chloe. It found me anyway. By the time I refinanced their mortgage in 2019, to lower the rate and protect their payment history, the bank paperwork had my name at the top and theirs below as authorized users on certain linked accounts. It was efficient. It meant I could fix things in a few taps if something went wrong. It also meant that the scaffolding holding up their comfort belonged to me in ways they never bothered to learn. I thought of all of that while the heater cleared the last of the fog from the glass. Through the gap I had wiped with my sleeve, the house glowed like a postcard. It used to be the sight of that tree would soften me. Tonight, it only helped me see. My phone buzzed once with a promotional email. I ignored it. Another memory surfaced, the one where a family friend asked Linda how she managed to raise 3 such different children. Linda laughed and said that Chloe was the heart, Daniel was the spirit, and Emily knew how to keep the lights on. Everyone smiled. I smiled too, because there are rooms where honesty is considered impolite. I shifted in my seat and let the words I never allowed myself to say settle into something solid. I had not been a daughter in this equation for a long time. I had been a bank with a familiar last name. I had been a quiet line item that made the rest of the story seem effortless. The anger that might have burned out in other seasons did not flare. It cooled into focus. The line between love and obligation stood out like fresh ink on a ledger. I picked up my phone and unlocked it, my thumb steady now. Outside the house, a car door slammed and voices approached. A couple hurried up the walkway, cheeks flushed, arms looped with gifts. The porch lights washed them in gold, and then the door opened and swallowed them whole. I watched for a moment longer. My pulse found a calm rhythm. I scrolled to the folder where I keep documents, accounts, authorizations, the refinance package, the list of cards where I was the primary and others were listed as authorized, the notes from the day I set up automatic payments to prevent late fees. Each file was a breadcrumb that led back to the same truth. There is power in being the person who keeps the ledger balanced. There is also power in choosing when you stop. I closed the folder and opened my contacts. The first name on the list that mattered was not family. It was Mark Johnson. We met in an accounting class at CSU when he still argued for fun, and I argued to finish the assignment early. Now he is a financial attorney who answers his phone when I call. I stared at his name and let the phone rest in my palm. One more memory rose without asking permission. It was the first time a client at the bank thanked me and meant it. He said that people only notice numbers when they are a problem, and that the person who prevents the problem rarely gets a handshake. He was wrong about one thing. The person who prevents the problem knows exactly where the switches are. I looked up at the house again. Music swelled. The curtain did not move. My breath fogged the glass for a beat and cleared. I felt the hook of hesitation, then felt it let go. There are moments when a story stops being what happened to you and becomes what you do next. My thumb hovered over the call button. I did not press it yet. I let the silence stretch and fill with the shape of what was coming. Then I turned the screen toward me and began to type. I pressed the call button and lifted the phone to my ear. It rang only once before a familiar voice came through, steady and warm, in a way I had almost forgotten. Mark Johnson was never one for small talk, but when he realized it was me, his tone softened. He listened as I laid out everything from the automatic drafts I had set up years ago to the refinance package with my signature at the top. He didn't interrupt, just let me speak until the words ran out. Then he said what no one in my family had ever said out loud. Every account, every line of credit, every authorization, Emily, they are yours. They might spend and pretend, but the paper trail is ironclad. If you wanted to, you could cut them off tonight. The truth settled into me like a second heartbeat. I thanked him, promising I'd follow up in his office after the holiday. When I hung up, the silence in the car wasn't heavy anymore. It was precise, like a tool I finally knew how to use. My thoughts drifted back to the office Christmas party a year ago, the last one before the world closed its doors. I had been standing near the punch bowl when a client approached praising me for saving his account during a brutal audit. His words were generous, loud enough for my manager to hear. For a brief moment, I felt seen. Then Chloe arrived, wearing a dress that shimmered like she'd stepped out of an ad. My boss lifted his glass to her colleagues, circled her, and the man who had been speaking to me excused himself mid-sentence to join the crowd. I stood there holding a plastic cup invisible again. That night, Sarah had touched my arm and whispered, "Not everyone is blind, Emily." She reminded me I wasn't completely erased, and for that, I carried her words like a shield. Now, with the heater humming and the house glowing across the street, my phone buzzed. A notification slid across the screen. At first I thought it was another seasonal promotion, but the number jolted me upright. A large purchase had been processed on one of my accounts. The card was mine, the one I had given Chloe once in a weak attempt to keep her from overdrafting. The charge was extravagant, obscene, even for her. I stared at the numbers and felt the calm in my chest tighten into something sharper. The house across the street swelled with laughter. I looked down at the glowing screen in my palm and let the truth harden. They hadn't just locked me out. They were still feeding on me, even as they toasted my absence. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to let it continue. Snow tapped against the windshield as I leaned back in the driver's seat, my fingers locked tight around the phone. My mother's voice echoed in my head, as if she were sitting beside me. "You were never a part of this family." She had said it once years ago when I asked why every photo on the mantel was of Chloe or Daniel, never me. It had been casual, like she was explaining the weather, but the words had sunk into me deeper than she could ever know. Tonight they replayed like a verdict. I pressed Mark's number again. He answered on the second ring, his voice low and steady, like he knew it was serious. I asked him straight. No small talk, no hesitation. If I shut down the accounts tonight, if I froze the cards and the mortgage drafts, was it legal? Could anyone touch me? There was a pause while he gathered his words, then he spoke with the precision of a man who lived by contracts. "Emily, everything is under your name. You are the primary on every account. They are only authorized users. You have every right to act." He stopped, then added quietly, "Maybe it is time you did." I thanked him and hung up, the sound of the call ending louder than the laughter drifting from across the street. My breath steadied. I opened the banking app with a swipe of my thumb. The screen lit my face as the snow kept falling, each flake catching in the glow of the streetlight. Mortgage, savings, credit cards, utilities. All of it laid out in neat rows, balances and due dates I knew by heart. Years of quiet sacrifice stacked on the glass in my hand. The heater hummed, and I scrolled through the accounts slowly, each line a reminder of the scaffolding I had built around their lives. My father's retirement check deposited, but never enough. My mother's card for groceries that overdrafted every few months. Chloe's endless charges from boutiques and hotels. Daniel's stopgap transfers labeled as business expenses, but always spent on something else. All of it routed through me, all of it carried on my back. I stared until the numbers blurred. A sharp gust rattled the car, and I pulled my coat tighter, but it was not the cold that made me shiver. It was the clarity. They had written me out of their story, locked me out of their house, but every detail of their comfort was still tied to me. The glass of champagne in my mother's hand, the music shaking the windows, the lights glowing against the snow. They believed they had erased me. They had not. I set the phone on the console and closed my eyes for a long breath. Anger would have been easier. What I felt was something cleaner, sharper. Justice. I whispered it to myself in the dark, letting the words settle. Justice would not come from them, not from apologies they would never make, or recognition they would never give. Justice would come from me. My eyes opened, and I lifted the phone again. My finger hovered over the option that would change everything. It was one tap away. I saw Chloe's charge still pending on my card, bold, as if daring me to act. The laughter from the house swelled again, a burst of music rising into the night. I tilted my head, listening to it fade under the sound of my own breath. I thought of every night I had balanced their accounts while they slept, every time I had pulled them back from the brink and been thanked with silence. The line was clear now. I was no longer going to carry them. My thumb tightened on the screen. The house across the street glittered oblivious. I leaned back, my lips pressing into a thin line as I whispered into the empty car. Justice will not come from them. It will come from me. The dashboard clock ticked over to midnight, and the screen refreshed. My pulse steadied. The choice was no longer abstract. It was time to move. Through the windshield, I could see the living room come alive like a theater set, every gesture rehearsed, every smile performed. Chloe held up her left hand, the diamond ring catching the light, as if she were presenting a crown. She angled her fingers just so, ensuring every guest saw it sparkle. Linda clasped her daughter's wrist with theatrical pride, her pearls swaying as she leaned close to whisper something that made Chloe tilt her head back and laugh. Daniel stood near the fireplace, his voice carrying above the carols. He waved his arms in wide arcs, telling another story about a deal he claimed was closing, a venture so promising that investors would be calling him any day. His audience nodded politely, eyes sliding toward the champagne more often than to him, but he never noticed. He loved the sound of his own certainty. Robert took his place at the center, glass-raised voice deep and sure. He spoke of resilience, of how the Carter family always weathered storms with cleverness and unity. I watched the guests nod, their faces glowing with admiration, as if they were looking at a portrait instead of people. None of them knew that the mortgage draft had bounced twice in the last year, or that the utilities were still scheduled under my name to keep the lights on, or that the unity Robert praised had required my silence more times than I could count. Pastor Williams was there, standing just behind the armchair where Linda sat like a queen. He spoke with solemn joy about what an example the Carters were, a beacon of community, a family bound not just by blood, but by strength of character. His words landed like nails hammered into a picture frame, holding the image steady for everyone to admire. He did not know, or chose not to see, that the picture was painted on borrowed canvas. I leaned back in my seat and let the sound of their applause drift faintly through the closed windows. To anyone watching from the outside, the Carters were perfect. To me, sitting in the dark, they were actors reading lines someone else had written, and I had been the stagehand too long. Inside, the charade deepened. Chloe stepped into the circle of guests again, holding her phone in one hand and the champagne flute in the other. She spoke about her fiancé, about plans for a spring wedding at a vineyard outside Boulder, about how blessed she was to have a family that made everything possible. I almost laughed. The vineyard was still unpaid, the deposit secured with my card, the blessing funded by me. She pressed the glass into the waiter's hand and gestured for more champagne. Her laugh rippled, confident and bright, as if the room existed only for her. I could read her lips through the window when she said, "Put it on the card." She pulled a shiny piece of plastic from her clutch, the very card that traced back to me, and waved it without a thought. She was sure it would glide through the machine just like it always had. The waiter smiled and nodded, disappearing toward the bar. Chloe turned back to her circle, twirling the flute between her fingers, already reaching for the next story. Linda leaned in to brush a strand of hair from her daughter's face, the gesture tender, maternal, and false. Robert clinked his glass again, drawing the room's attention back to his voice. Daniel shouted over him, insisting his next investment would make headlines by January. The room shimmered with lights, laughter, and champagne bubbles. I stared at my phone glowing in my hand, the app still open, the account still waiting. Each balance stared back like a witness. I could feel the rhythm of my heart syncing with the silent countdown inside me. It would only take a decision, a single confirmation, and everything they believed was untouchable would vanish into the air. Through the glass, I saw Chloe toss her hair back, her lips shaping another story of luck and love. The waiter reappeared at the edge of the room tray, balanced, ready to deliver. My grip on the phone tightened as the snow fell thicker, muting the world outside, while the Carter house roared with celebration. I drew in a long breath, steady and deliberate, and let my eyes follow the waiter as he set the tray down, preparing to swipe the card Chloe had offered so carelessly. My thumb hovered over the screen, the final step waiting. I tapped the screen, and the first account grayed out. Checking frozen. Another tap, and savings followed. My breath slowed as I slid my finger down the list. Mortgage credit lines, every stream that fed the glow inside that house. One by one, the switches flipped quiet and final. The heater in my car hummed as if marking the rhythm. Inside the window, Chloe leaned against the bar with her phone still in her hand, her laughter carrying above the music. The waiter slid her card through the machine. For a second, nothing happened. He frowned, swiped again, shook the reader, then glanced up with an apologetic look. Chloe waved it off with confidence, pulling another card from her clutch. The same silence followed. A red light blinked. Declined. I watched her smile falter just a shade as she reached for a third card. Her hand shook slightly, this time her laugh forced. Guests around her shifted, whispers sparking like static. The waiter looked toward Robert, who stepped forward, jaw tight. He pulled his own wallet, handed over a card, with the pride of a man certain of control. The reader chirped and blinked red again. Declined. The room changed. Laughter thinned. The carols kept playing but sounded wrong, too loud in the pause that followed. Linda pressed a hand to her chest, eyes wide, then turned to the guests with a polished smile. She blamed the machine, said the bank was down, told them not to worry. Her voice had the trained tone of someone who had spent a lifetime covering cracks with paint. But her hand gripped Robert's arm so tightly that his face twitched. Daniel moved next, fishing out a sleek black card, holding it up like a magician about to prove a trick. When it failed, the flush on his cheeks deepened to crimson. A cousin whispered to another. A woman in sequins leaned toward Pastor Williams, her words hidden, but her expression unmistakable. Shock. The pastor did not answer. He stood still, lips pressed into a thin line, eyes lowered as if the floor might give him guidance. The weight of silence pressed heavier than the snow on the roof. I leaned closer to the glass, my breath fogging a small circle. Their perfect scene was cracking. The ring Chloe had flashed earlier seemed dull now the champagne flute sat empty, the glow of triumph drained from their faces. Chloe snapped at the waiter, her voice sharp, demanding he try again. He did, and again the same red light pulsed. Declined. Guests began to murmur, openly, glances darting toward the door, the coats piled on chairs, the night waiting to swallow them back into the cold. Robert slammed his palm against the counter, insisting he would call the bank. Linda hushed him, her smile fraying at the edges. Chloe gripped her clutch like it might disappear. Daniel poured himself another drink with hands that shook too much to hide. Through the window I saw them for what they were. Not hosts of a grand holiday, not the family admired by their community, but people stripped of power in an instant. The masks had slipped, and the truth was there for everyone to witness. I sat back in the driver's seat, my chest steady, eyes fixed on the chaos unraveling behind glass. For years I had been the invisible force holding everything together. Tonight, I was the silence that took it all away. The snow thickened outside, softening the world around me. But inside that house, nothing was soft anymore. Every smile had hardened, every whisper turned to judgment, every toast cut short. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the weight of it settle. Justice was not loud. Justice was precise. When I opened them again, the window framed the Carter family for what they truly were. Powerless, cornered, and finally exposed. By February, the snow had started to thin in Denver, but the cold around the Carter name had only deepened. The notice from Rocky Mountain Trust went out, first crisp paper with bold letters that left no room for excuses. Foreclosure proceedings had begun. I imagined Linda opening the envelope at the kitchen table, her hands shaking as she tried to explain away numbers she had never once managed herself. The house that had been her stage was about to be reclaimed by the very bank where I had built my career. The fallout rippled quickly. Chloe marched into a downtown dealership one Saturday morning, heels clicking, coat slung over her shoulder, confidence intact. She sat across from a young loan officer filling out the forms for a new luxury SUV. I knew because word spread fast in a city like ours, especially when gossip met justice. The clerk ran her application and came back with a tight smile, the kind used when delivering bad news politely. Her credit history, he explained, was insufficient. The accounts tied to her name had been frozen, her score gutted by delinquent charges. Chloe laughed at first, then demanded he run it again. He did, and when the screen blinked red, she slammed her pen on the desk and stormed out, every eye in the showroom following her as the automatic doors closed behind her. Daniel's unraveling came in public too. He had been juggling personal loans for months, calling them investments, convincing friends and colleagues he was on the verge of a breakthrough. By mid-February, the creditors stopped listening. One morning, 2 uniformed officers walked into the office where he had been selling half-promises and collected him in front of his coworkers. I heard later that he tried to laugh it off, said it was a misunderstanding, but no one believed him as they watched him led away. His desk was cleared out before he even had the chance to call home. The neighborhood whispered louder with each passing week. Cindy Lopez, who lived across the street, was never one to stay silent when a story this big landed on her doorstep. She was at the corner coffee shop when she told anyone who would listen that the Carters were finished. They used to boast about their connections, about Chloe's wedding plans, about Daniel's ventures, about Robert's wisdom. Now the house stood with a foreclosure sign planted in the front yard, and the curtains stayed closed even in daylight. Cindy shook her head and said it plain. The family that bragged the loudest now had nothing left to show. I drove past the old place one evening after work. The snow on the lawn was dirty, shoveled half-heartedly, the Christmas lights still dangling, though February winds had tangled them into knots. The windows that once glowed with warm parties now reflected nothing but empty rooms. A moving truck idled at the curb, men carrying out boxes while Robert stood on the porch, his shoulders sagging, his voice too low to carry. Linda clutched her coat tight around her, her eyes darting toward the neighbors who had gathered to watch. Chloe sat in her car with the engine running, refusing to step outside. Daniel was nowhere in sight, his absence louder than if he had been standing there. I sat in my own car a block away, unseen, watching the final pieces fall into place. There was no pleasure in it, not the kind they would expect. What I felt was release, the weight of years sliding off my shoulders. They had built their story on my silence and my labor, and when I withdrew, both the structure collapsed. The sun dipped behind the Rockies, painting the sky a pale gold that faded into gray. I turned the wheel and pulled away from the curb, leaving the Carter house smaller in my rearview mirror with each block. I knew this was not the end, only the point where endings became beginnings. The lease papers were still crisp when I slid them into the drawer of my new apartment downtown. The space smelled faintly of fresh paint and cedar from the boxes I had unpacked earlier that day. Outside, Denver's lights stretched wide across the evening, a glittering grid that hummed with a different kind of life than the suburbs I had left behind. My living room window faced west, framing the mountains, their ridges shadowed under winter clouds. It was smaller than the house I grew up in, but it was mine, and every square foot carried my name alone. I dragged a box labeled Holiday toward the center of the floor. The tape peeled back with a sigh, and inside were ornaments I had collected over years of being the background in someone else's story. A glass star I bought during college but was never allowed to hang. A string of silver lights I once offered to Linda that she dismissed as too modern. Tiny ceramic bells Daniel had left in my car by mistake, which I had kept for myself instead of returning. Each piece held a memory of being overlooked, but tonight they were mine to claim. I set up a small artificial tree in the corner by the window. The branches unfolded stiffly at first, then softened as I bent them into shape. I looped the silver lights, hung the glass star, tucked the ceramic bells near the center. Slowly, the tree grew bright, not grand, but steady, a reflection of what I had learned to be. I stepped back and switched off the overhead light. The room glowed in quiet gold shadows dancing across the bare walls. I sank onto the couch with a blanket pulled across my lap and let the stillness seep in. There were no voices calling me dramatic, no footsteps demanding help, no eyes waiting for me to fix what they had broken. Only the hum of traffic below and the steady blink of the lights I had placed myself. My phone buzzed once on the table. I did not reach for it. Whoever it was, whatever new demand or excuse might fill the screen, it could wait forever. I had lived too long answering calls that left me hollow. Tonight, the silence was the gift. I thought about the years I had been told family meant sacrifice without recognition, that blood was enough to excuse betrayal, that being the responsible one was its own reward. The house I left behind stood now as proof that those lessons were lies. Families can fail. Blood can wound deeper than strangers. And respect is not inherited. It is built guarded and demanded. I stood and walked to the window, pulling the curtain aside. The reflection of the tree met me in the glass lights flickering against the night outside. My own face stared back softer than it had been in months, framed by the glow I had created. The thought came not as anger, but as truth spoken plain. Family is not always safe. But justice and respect, I carved those for myself. I let the curtain fall, turned back toward the room, and watched the trees shimmer in the quiet. The air carried no bitterness, only a calm that filled every corner. The story I had lived was no longer theirs to control. It was mine.